Let's open up your Bibles, if you will, to Zechariah and chapter 14. As I had just mentioned, we are in the 5th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and beginning several weeks before the Feast of Passover, we began going through selected chapters of Exodus in preparation for and as a part of this feast, because everything that happened during the plagues before they left Egypt is related directly and in a variety of ways to the first holy days of the year, the Feast of Passover. Now, God, we had read in I think a few places in one of those chapters so far, that God said that these days were to be instituted as an everlasting ordinance. And that's a term that basically means forever, continually holy days to be kept. And I think we all know that these are part of God's annual holy days that are required to be kept to this day, and as we will see in a moment, even into the future. So as a reminder of God's appointed times of these ceremony and the convoking with each other and with God, they are found throughout the scriptures, and there is evidence actually that these days were kept even during the time of Adam, when Cain and Abel came to God, as it says, in the process of time, which is a term that means at the end of days. That means counting days to a particular time when they were to come and present offerings. And there's then also evidence that Abraham marked these days. There are certain events that likely occurred on days such as Passover, such as the mock offering of Isaac. So God's way of life, we had discussed in some of the readings of Exodus, his way of life was lost to the people of Israel. This occurred several generations after Jacob and his sons had come down into Israel and established a colony there. And because God's way was lost to them, they did not practice God's way of life. They went into bondage, and there are several scriptures, some of which we mentioned, indicating that. We have been studying how the representation found in those events leading to God bringing them out of Egypt and establishing his covenant eventually with them, reestablishing, if you will, his covenant with tens of thousands of descendants of Jacob. He gave them a series of holy days. He made known to them the commandments by which to live. And he said that they were to be an everlasting ordinance, to be kept forever throughout your generations, he says. And so those days, the days that we are now in the midst of, these days are part of those that have been kept since that time by a variety of people. Oh, they have been lost, they have been found, lost and found several times over the centuries, but they were kept, and they were kept by Jesus and his disciples. They kept these days, and no honest believer who reads the scriptures can say that they were not. It's a fact. And even those who think that they're no longer required have to admit that they were kept by Jesus, by his disciples, and the Apostle Paul proclaimed over and over again that these are days that need to be kept. However, there continues to be a denial of this, despite the fact that nothing in the Bible says anything of the sort, that the days are no longer required. And I want to just read briefly a prophecy from the prophet Zechariah. It's a prophecy of our future and what is going to happen both before and after Christ returns. So Zechariah 14 and verse 1 says, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city." So this is portraying the time of Jacob's trouble, the great tribulation. Then the Eternal will go forth and fight against those nations. And that won't happen right away, but eventually, after several years, in the prophecies that we compare in Revelation and other places, God will become a part of this battle as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. And again, this directly relates to a refashioning of that area, that there is going to be a millennial temple. And I'll talk a bit about that later. In Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48 describe a millennial temple and specific dimensions, the size of which it wouldn't fit in that area right now on the Temple Mount. There's going to have to be a refashioning of the land. And it says, you shall flee through my mountain valley, for the valley shall reach to Azel, which is a place we don't know what that is, where that was in ancient times. We're not sure where it is today. You shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Thus the Eternal my God will come, and all the saints with you. And it shall come to pass in that day that there will be no light, the lights will diminish. It shall be one day, which is known to the Eternal, neither day nor night, but at evening time it shall happen that it will be light. So more miracles taking place. And in that day it shall be that living water shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, half of them toward the western sea. In both summer and winter it shall occur, and the Eternal shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be the Lord is one, and his name one. So it kind of moves forward to after Christ returns and how it's going to be established in something, describing some things that will be set up in that area after he returns. All the land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. Jerusalem shall be raised up and inhabited in her place from Benjamin's gate to the place of the first gate and the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. And the people shall dwell in it. And no longer shall there be utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. And obviously this is referring to after he returns. And his government is established as a headquarters in that area. And then it goes back to talk about a few things that will happen before he returns. And this shall be the plague with which the Eternal will strike all the people who fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets. Their tongue shall dissolve in their mouths. It shall come to pass in that day that a great panic from the Eternal will be among them. Everyone will seize the hand of his neighbor, in other words, infighting. They won't even be able to know who's the enemy here, and raise his hand against his neighbor's hand. Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of the surrounding nations shall be gathered together, gold, silver, and apparel in great abundance. And such also shall be the plague on the horse and the mule and the camel and the donkey and on all the cattle that will be in those camps. So shall this plague be. And so after Christ returns, there's going to be a number of plagues. This is talking about, it puts it in the category of a single plague, but so it's talking about when Christ actually comes with tens of thousands of saints, as said in Jude, that there will be this final battle against all those who reject God and all those who are fighting against him, God eliminating every bit of resistance throughout the area. And it shall come to pass in verse 16, who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So it's talking about people being called to one of the pilgrimage feasts, the last pilgrimage feast of the year, the Feast of Tabernacles. And it says that they will come up, and it's referring to them coming up and learning about this is what we are to do. Here is how we are to live. This is a part of God's ordinance forever. And it shall be, it says in verse 17, whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague with which the Eternal strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we see that God is going to establish a significant branch of his kingdom on the earth when Christ returns. And when he does, the knowledge of God is going to be taught beginning in Jerusalem, but not just there, all over different parts of the planet. He is going to call people up. And eventually that they will come up. It says that Assyria and Egypt are going to be one with Israel at that time. And he even refers to those people and those nations as being a type of his son, just as he referred to the people of Israel. And so the knowledge of God is going to spread from that location. As Christ said, it's going to spread like leaven that is placed in 3 measures of flour. And so it's going to start in the Middle East. There's going to be a measure of land in the Middle East that Christ is going to inhabit with his saints, a headquarters built there, the millennial temple, as Ezekiel describes. And his way of life is going to affect the entire planet eventually. And there are a few, not just more than a few, probably dozens of prophecies that point to that. And one of them is indicated in Habakkuk 2:14, where it says that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And so mentioned by Zechariah in some of the scriptures we had just read is the Feast of Tabernacles. That is going to be enforced. There are other millennial prophecies that point also to the observance of the Feast of Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that is. And in fact, all of God's holy days are going to be kept by everyone at that time. And you and I are doing something that everybody is eventually going to learn about, and everybody is going to be required to keep them. And if they do not, well, they're going to have to suffer the consequences at that time. It's going to be, God will have to be further persuasive to accepting his way of life. And so Ezekiel 44, if you will, back to the book of Ezekiel, beginning in chapter 40 of, I'm not going to go back to chapter 40, I want you to go to 44, but beginning in chapter 40 and throughout the last 8 chapters of the book of Ezekiel, it's an extensive prophecy describing in great detail a temple that will exist when Christ returns. There are precise measurements found in these prophecies describing, how tall and how long and wide walls will be. It describes courtyards. There is a description of furniture and functions and people that will live in this live and work in and around the temple and the surrounding territory, how it's going to be divided into parcels of land that will be inhabited by the 12 tribes that are going to be brought out of the nations. Most of the nations that where the descendants of those tribes exist don't even know who they are anymore. But God knows who they are, and he's going to bring them back to this land in what is described as a second Exodus that is going to be so massive and so amazing that the first Exodus is going to pale in comparison. Now we know that Ezekiel's is a prophecy of the future for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to go into all those right now. But notice what's written about priests that will work in that future temple, Levites, that is, specifically it says sons of Zadok, which was a favored descendant of Aaron who was favored because of his continual and constant faithfulness to God. And Ezekiel 44 in verse 20 says that they shall neither shave their heads nor let their hair grow, talking about the priests, not let their hair grow long, but they shall keep their hair well trimmed. No priest shall drink wine when he enters the inner court. They shall not take as a wife a widow or a divorced woman, but take virgins of the descendants of the house of Israel, or widows of priests. And they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the unholy. And it's basically just summarizing all of God's commandments, his statutes and judgments. That which is holy, contrary to that which is unholy. And cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. Same concept, and that is found in why we keep the food laws. God gave those for a reason, so that we would physically do something that we are to be practicing spiritually. In controversy, they shall stand as judges, this is verse 24, and judge it according to my judgments. They shall keep my laws and my statutes in all my appointed meetings. They shall hallow my Sabbaths. So it's talking about the appointed meetings is all of the times that God says, here is when we are required to convoke. These are the times we are required to come before him. And of course, the priesthood, there are going to be a lot of other times when they are required to go to the temple and to perform certain duties other than the holy days. But of course, the holy days are included, and God even gives a list of specific things that the priests are to do on certain holy days. And those things are going to be reestablished. They're going to be restarted once again. And the appointed meetings that he talks about is going to be something that everybody will have to participate in to a degree. It says, hallow my Sabbaths at the end of verse 24. Now, if you go forward one chapter to chapter 45, probably just look over to the other page. Notice what it says about the calendar here, beginning in verse 18, about the calendar by which God's holy days are to be kept. Thus says the Lord God, in the first month, on the first day of the first month, you shall take a young bull without blemish and cleanse the sanctuary. And it's talking about the beginning of the year. And it's not a holy day, but there are certain things that the priests are to do. The priest shall take some of the blood on the sin offering and put it on the doorposts of the temple, on the four corners of the ledge of the altar, and on the doorposts of the gate of the inner court. And so you shall do on the seventh day of the month for everyone who has sinned unintentionally or in ignorance. Thus you shall make atonement for the temple. It's not the day of atonement, but it's making an atonement. And then it goes on to say in verse 21, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall observe the Passover, a feast of 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. And on that day the prince shall prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering. On the 7 days of the feast he shall prepare a burnt offering to the Eternal, 7 bulls, 7 rams without blemish, daily for 7 days, and a kid of the goats daily for a sin offering. And he shall prepare a grain offering of 1 ephah for each bull and 1 ephah for each ram, together with a hin of oil for each ephah. And so it's talking about certain things that were to be done by the prince and the priesthood, but in accordance with the observance of Passover, the Feast of Passover, which is another way of just saying the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then in verse 25, in the 7th month, on the 15th day of the month, at the feast, he shall do likewise for 7 days, according to the sin offering, the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the oil. Well, what is he talking about in the 7th month? Another set of holy days that is 7 days long. The Feast of Tabernacles. He's talking about the Feast of Tabernacles that is observed in the 7th month and on the beginning on the 15th day of the month. And so these are just a few of the scriptures that are showing us that God's holy days were not just for people of ancient times, that they were just for people long ago and it's forgotten and we don't need to think about them ever again. No, they were for those people then. He set an everlasting ordinance, and they are for people now, and they will be for people in the future, people of all times. And everybody on the earth is going to be required to keep them one day. And so it's what we look to, therefore, when we keep these holy days today. It's what we consider, actually, even on every Sabbath, every week, a reminder of God's kingdom and what will be established at that time. And though the Feast of Tabernacles is, they all represent something, and they all have different aspects of their observance that portray a plan and parts of God's plan for people on the earth. The Feast of Tabernacles focuses on the millennium, but the millennium is considered in all of them. All of God's appointed days point to the kingdom to come, even the weekly Sabbath today, the 7th day, 7th of the 1,000-year period where Christ will rain on the earth at that time for 1,000 years. Leviticus 23, if you will. Today's sermon is going to be a bit technical, and for the main point of today's message, we're going to hear about another ceremony that has holy implications, but it's a ceremony that was not usually performed on a holy day. And so we're going to move out of the book of Exodus, and we are going to discuss something that's related to the Feast of Passover. That is, it falls within the framework of the days of unleavened bread. And after God gave instructions about offerings for this first feast of the year, in verses preceding what we are going to read, and those instructions for Passover and unleavened bread are found in Leviticus 23 and verses 4 through 8. But I'd like to go down to another set of verses, beginning in verse 9, where it says, "And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give to you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Eternal to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." And it goes on to describe offerings that will be made at that time as well, other offerings. And it says in verse 14 about this wave offering, "You shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain, until the same day that you have brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings." So, regarding these verses, verses 9 through 14, some translations of the Bible will have a subheader above them. There are subheaders in my Bible above all of these sets of instructions. One says the Sabbath, the next says the Passover and unleavened bread. Above the verses we had just read, my Bible calls it the Feast of Firstfruits. However, it's not a feast. These are not holy days. This is not describing a holy day. It never says anything about a holy convocation or anything of the like. It is a day of offering, and that's all. The wave sheaf offering was a ritual that was performed by the high priest. Now, I lean to the understanding that it was a single sheaf that was waved by the high priest alone, and he waved it on behalf of the entire nation. Some believe differently, that it was multiple sheaves waved by many priests. I believe that this was a part of the high priest's duties, the high priest of the temple, to wave a single sheaf during these days of the Feast of Passover, and it was performed by him on behalf of the entire nation. Now, the sheaf waved on the day after the weekly Sabbath occurs within the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that is our understanding, where it says the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it, and that's the last sentence in verse 11. But this timing is debated. Not by many, but it is debated by some. And I guess if you consider the Jews, it would be debated by many before they are many people. Some believe that the sheaf was waved on the day after the first high day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this is where we get a little technical, but I think it's worth considering. So they believe the sheaf was waved on the day after an annual Sabbath and not the weekly Sabbath. In fact, that's what most Jews believe. And if you have a copy of the Hebrew calendar, or if we pull one up on the website, you will see that is what that calendar that they put out indicates. However, consider the instructions given for enumeration and counting, and consider it to the instructions given for God's other holy days. So look at verse 5 of Leviticus 23 for a moment. It says, on the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. It's talking about the Passover ceremony. The next verse, and on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. And so they are specific dates given for these two observances. And they are connected observances, but nonetheless, 14th Passover ceremony, 15th begins the first of 7 days of unleavened bread. In verse 24, let's go forward in this same chapter quite a bit. Go to verse 24. This is talking about the Feast of Trumpets, specifically called the Memorial of Blowing of Trumpets. It says, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So this is one of God's holy days, and it's in fact one of the pilgrimage. No, it's not. This isn't one of the pilgrimages. The Feast of Weeks is one of the pilgrimages, but this is just after the second pilgrimage feast. And I'm going to get to the Feast of Weeks in a moment. Look at verse 27 regarding the Day of Atonement. Also, the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you, and you shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Eternal. So it's talking about atonement and the offering by fire that was to be made just by the priests. It's not talking about everybody go out and present an offering by fire on atonement. So there's a command to keep the holy day, and then we see instructions that were of different offerings to be given just by the priests. That's why the book's called Leviticus. It's talking about the Levites. But the holy days are for everybody. And so, again, a specific date on the calendar, the 10th day of the 7th month. Now look at verse 34, if you will. And here are instructions regarding the Feast of Tabernacles. And it says, speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. Again, a specific date, the 15th day of the 7th month. And you might be saying, okay, well, where are you going with this, Terry? I can see that. It's pretty simple. It's plain and simple that these dates are given on the calendar. Now, unlike the holy days that we have just looked at, that have specific dates on the calendar, the wave sheaf does not have a specific date. And also when we look at the instructions for the Feast of Weeks, it too does not have a specific date. And the reason is because those two events, the wave sheaf as well as the Feast of Weeks, they do not fall on the same date on the calendar every single year. Well, why is that? Why do they not fall on the same dates? Can you let them know of the calendar every year? Sorry, there's some noise coming. We have other people using different parts of this building over here. So Pentecost, the observance of Pentecost, also known as the Feast of Weeks, it requires a count to be made. And that count does not begin on the same calendar date each year. Just as the weekly Sabbaths that you and I observe every single week, they do not usually fall on the same date of the calendar from year to year. They move back and forth. So does Pentecost move back and forth a bit annually due to the instruction of the wave sheaf being waved on the morrow after what? The weekly Sabbath that does not fall on the same calendar date each year. Leviticus 23 and verse 15, here are instructions regarding the Feast of Weeks, where it says, you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days after the 7th Sabbath, then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Eternal. So in other words, count 7 Sabbaths, and then 7 times 7 is 49. On the 50th day, that is going to be the observance of the Feast of Weeks. Now think about this. And maybe you haven't wondered, but this is just, if you haven't even thought about it, this is something that you can have in your arsenal if this question ever arises. If the wave sheaf was to be offered on the same day every year, which the Jews traditionally say it was they always offer it, or they portray it being offered on the 16th day of the first month, the day after the first high day of unleavened bread. First high day of unleavened bread is always on the 15th, always. It's not the 15th of the calendar we use, for business and what have you, but in the Hebrew calendar, it's always on the 15th. And they say the wave offering, always on the 16th, always on the 16th. Well, if that were the case, there would be no need for a command to count a number of days and weeks. What would be the point? Because the Feast of Weeks would always be on the same date. Every single year it would be the same date. And God would have simply said, the 16th of this month is the wave sheaf, and then the 5th of the third month is the Feast of Weeks. Plain simple. No reason to count anything. So it would be pointless to put those instructions about counting if it fell on the same day of the year every single year. In addition, there's this to consider. If we were supposed to begin the count on the day after the first high day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which would be the 16th day of the first month, close to 90% of the time, and I looked this up, we calculated this some time ago, close to 90% of the time, there would be more than 7 Sabbaths that would occur within that 50-day period. And that would violate the command. God says count 7 Sabbaths. And then the 50th day after that 7th Sabbath is the holy day. But the Jews, they keep it on a fixed date every year. It is called, if you look at a Hebrew calendar, it is called, and I may mispronounce it, I think it's Shavuot, S-H-A-V-O-U-T. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. But it's the Feast of Weeks, and it is observed on the 6th of Sivan. Every single year, the same date, the 6th of Sivan. This year, the 6th of Sivan, Shavuot, their marking of the Feast of Weeks, falls on a Wednesday. Now, if we're told to observe Pentecost the day after the Sabbath, after you count 7 Sabbaths, Wednesday is nowhere close to a Sabbath, nowhere near a Sabbath. So that doesn't match with the instructions of the Torah. And what my point is we can trust the Hebrew calendar as a timekeeper. We can do that for the beginning of the year and for most of the holy days that are marked. For the new moons, it's accurate as far as that goes. But we cannot agree with their interpretation of Leviticus 23:11 because their tradition does not fit the instructions of the Torah. And you think that, Jews are very critical about many things. You think they would say, wait a minute, this doesn't match. We need to adjust something, but that is not the case. I had spoken with a person about this, and I talked to him fairly regularly, not every week or anything, but I talked to this individual fairly regularly. He is a scholar, very smart. He's a Kohen, which basically means he is a known legitimate descendant of Aaron. He has the right to actually be a part of working in the temple if he were to be chosen for that purpose. But he does believe in Christ. He does believe Christ is the Messiah. And I'd asked him some questions about this, about why they calculate it this way and why they fix a date on the calendar for the Feast of Weeks, always on the 6th of Sivan. And his response was a little technical, and I understood most of it. I think I asked him if we could continue to talk about this a little bit because I want to see what his opinion is on a few other things. But his response regarding their reason for doing so, and he says this, I quote, he said, "It's non-biblical and therefore is not founded in the Torah, but in the oral law of Judaism." Now, of course, I personally have a big problem with that, because the printed Word of God is what we are told to live by. And so if we disregard some of that and say, well, I'm going to live by something else that's not found here, but I think it's good, and I'm going to live by that instead of this, then I have a problem with that. And I think you would as well. Deuteronomy 16, if you will. Go forward to Deuteronomy 16. So the only way that God's instruction for the day of the wave sheaf offering, which is really the focal point that I want to hone in on today, the only way his instructions make sense is when we begin counting after the weekly Sabbath. And that results in the Feast of Weeks not being a fixed day on the calendar, but it results in the Feast of Weeks moving back and forth a bit, but always coming or being observed on the day after a weekly Sabbath, which is exactly what the instructions say. The morrow after the seventh Sabbath, you shall have the memorial of blowing of trumpets. And so that's the reason why God did not give the wave sheaf offering a numbered day on the calendar. He didn't say it's the 16th day of the first month. It's a reason he did not give a numbered day for the Feast of Weeks. It is not going to be fixed on the calendar. But in the other scenario that I'm mentioning, it would be fixed. Always would be the same day. The instructions clearly say that it is to be a count of weeks. And here's another place in Deuteronomy 16. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9 says that you shall count 7 weeks for yourself, you shall count 7 weeks for yourself, begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. It's talking about the day of the wave sheaf, when that first sheaf is harvested, cut, and offered. Verse 10 says, then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Eternal, your God, with a tribute of a freewill offering from your hand you shall give as the Eternal, your God, blesses you. And so the Feast of Weeks is the second commanded offering of the year. There are 3 times a year that offerings by everyone is commanded. One is during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, second during the Feast of Weeks. So in order for a count to 7 weeks to be complete, think about that. A complete count, meaning a complete week. Every 7 times a complete week. The enumeration would need to begin when? When should we count? If we wanted to have 7 sets of complete weeks together, when would we start to count? Wednesday? Monday? No, we would always begin to count the first day of the week, the day after a weekly Sabbath. And only then can the weeks be complete. Any other day would end up with 6 complete weeks, and then you'd have 2 partial weeks on either end. But after 7 weeks are complete, we can observe the Feast of Weeks, and that's a legitimate count to the Feast of Weeks. Now today is a weekly Sabbath. This weekly Sabbath falls within the framework of the 7 days of unleavened bread, and that means that tomorrow would be the day that a sheaf was to be waved. And the sheaf itself has profound implications on why it was waved, what purpose it served, what it represents. And we've heard about this many times before. I'm not going to go into all the details today of how it represents Christ, who was offered once for all. I'm just going to talk about some of the aspects of this single sheaf that was offered on behalf of all the people. And if you want more about it, we have, in our library, can't give you exact titles, but we've had sermons at the Eternal Church of God anyway, several dozen times talking about the wave sheaf, and some of us that have been in the church for longer than the Eternal Church of God has existed, I'm sure has heard many dozens of sermons about the wave sheaf. But I want to consider some of the details today. Again, not going into everything. I want to keep this sermon, I'd like to have it less than an hour. I've already spent a half hour, so I better get moving here. John chapter 6. John chapter 6. I think I've been talking about a half hour. Looks like it to me. Yeah. What may be the most interesting aspect of the wave sheaf is that the day the sheaf was waved is the same day that Christ ascended to heaven. So the sheaf, the wave sheaf, it's referred to as a first fruit offering. And the description of that sheaf relates to Christ as being the first human being to be offered, to be raised from the dead, and ascending to heaven as a glorified spirit being. The Apostle Paul had said in Colossians 1 that he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. And other books written by the apostles describe him as being a type of first fruits. There are many similarities between Christ and the wave sheaf offering. Christ's death, his resurrection, his ascension. The sheaf was the first to be harvested from the land, as it says in Leviticus 23:14, and Christ is the first human being to be harvested from the earth. No other grain, it says, as we read in Leviticus 23, no other grain could be harvested and eaten until the sheaf was waved. And so, no other human being would be able to be raised and ascend until Christ was raised and ascended. He set the pattern. To wave the sheaf means that the priest lifted it into the air and he moved it back and forth gently, and like presenting it before God symbolically, and God accepting it as an offering, a suitable offering. And the term sheaf, it can also mean omer. And an omer is a measurement of grain equivalent to approximately 2 quarts, as we would know it. Israel was previously told to gather this amount of manna each day for every person to eat every day while they were in the wilderness. Now, the manna was a vitally important aspect of their diet, a staple, if you will. It's primarily what they survived on. I think they likely ate some other things as well, but primarily that's what they ate, the manna. It kept them alive, giving life to the entire congregation. And Christ spoke of himself as being the reality of what the manna portrayed. In John 6, in verse 32, Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven." So Moses was an instrument by which the bread came, but it came from the Father, and he gives the true bread from heaven. In other words, not that the manna wasn't true, not that it wasn't real, but it represented something much greater. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always." They thought he was just talking about bread, about regular food. We're still hungry. You know, we enjoyed what you gave before, and we would like some more of that. Can you give us this bread always? And Jesus said to them, verse 35, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." It's talking about becoming a spirit being. There's no need to eat, although I think the people in the spirit, God's dimension, they do eat. There's descriptions of spiritual trees and grass and food. There's the wedding supper that's described. In any case, there wouldn't be a need for food and drink to sustain you like we need today. In verse 36, "But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. All that the Father gives me, I will come to me, and the one who comes to me, I will by no means cast him out. For I have come down from heaven, like the manna did, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." And so through Christ is the opportunity to have eternal life and not have a need to eat. So he is the true bread that gives life. If you jump down several verses, I'd like to read a few more, and beginning in verse 48. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, speaking of his offering, of himself, his life, which I shall give for the life of the world. And so people did not understand these sayings. They were quite confused at what he was saying. How can he give us his flesh to eat? This is weird. What is he talking about? And so they didn't have a spiritual understanding of these things. And many people continue not to understand it fully today. But there are many profound implications to these words that he spoke. And they're reflected not only in the unleavened bread that we eat this week, but they are reflected in food in general, food that we need to eat to sustain us. And included in this is this omer of manna that they were told to gather every day. And then the wave sheaf offering was to be an omer of grain that contained no leaven. No leaven. There was only a single offering every year that was allowed to contain leaven. And not just allowed, it was actually required that they put leaven in a single offering every year. I'm not going to talk about that today. We'll wait till the Feast of Weeks comes around to talk about that and the reason why. And so a procedure for harvesting the wave sheaf once a year, it's not dictated in the scriptures exactly how you should do this. And I don't think there was actually a set method that needed to be followed in order to harvest a sheaf of grain. Alfred Edersheim described a method that he says was used during the time of Christ, but I would add that this author, Edersheim, who wrote a very interesting book regarding the temple, its ministry and services during the time of Christ, and I think that that book is pretty accurate, mostly accurate anyway, but that author also indicates that the day of the offering was on the 16th of the first month, and again, that's not in line with what the Torah says. And I don't think that's accurate. Luke 23, and you don't have to turn there, but Luke 23, that chapter indicates that Christ was crucified on a preparation day for Sabbath. Now, that has confused many, and we have tens of millions of people around the world that believe Christ was crucified on a Friday and was resurrected Sunday morning. And that is not the case. And really, it doesn't take much effort to figure out that that is not the case. The Apostle John felt it necessary to make it known exactly what Sabbath it was that Christ died, or before he died, the preparation day for the Sabbath after he died. In John 19 and verse 14, it says that it was the preparation day for the Passover, meaning the feast of Passover, the first high day of unleavened bread, which is an annual Sabbath. And then John wrote also in verse 31 of chapter 19, he said, for that Sabbath was a high day. It's pretty clear, it was not Friday. It was not the day before the weekly Sabbath. And so this means that there were two Sabbaths that occurred after Christ had died. Two Sabbaths in which the 3 days and 3 nights were fulfilled when Christ's body was in the sepulcher. There was the annual Sabbath, the high day, as John mentioned in John 19, verse 31, and also the weekly Sabbath. Mark 16, if you'd go back to the book of Mark, in the final chapter of the book of Mark. Both John and Mark indicate that Mary Magdalene is the one, or at least was one of the ones that came to the tomb first. Now, John notes that it was before dawn on Sunday morning when she arrived and she saw that the stone blocking the entrance had been moved. So it was dark, as he says, and the stone had already been moved. He had already risen, meaning it was not Sunday morning when he rose. In Mark 16, verse 9, it says, "Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept." Now these verses, obviously, they do not contain the complete chronology of events after Christ was not found in the tomb. There are several other perspectives to consider. So in order to complete the picture, we would have to turn to the other accounts of what happened and compare them and put them into a correct order. And it could be challenging to do that. And many people are still confused on how it actually, the chronology of how it all actually played out. And I'm not going to do that today. I'm not going to go through all that today. The point I would like to make is that even though he had been raised when Mary Magdalene came to the tomb, he had not yet ascended to heaven. This was again a connection to the wave sheaf ceremony. So Mary Magdalene, it says, was the first person that saw Jesus alive after he had died, and we read that in verses 9 through 10 here of Mark 16. But as a side note, and it is worth noting, even that point right there is debated by some as not being true, not being factual. Some actually believe that half of the chapter of the book of Mark, the last half of the chapter of the book of Mark, is a fabrication, and that it was added to the text centuries later, centuries after Mark had written his gospel. My research does not find that to be the case. Now, when we read, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but just to give you some things to consider, when we read verses 9 through 20, and you can do it later, just read those verses all by themselves. Is there any reason why somebody would want to insert those verses into the scriptures? I don't see anything. I don't see any extra biblical information or some kind of hidden agenda or some narrative that somebody is trying to, insert into the scriptures. I don't see any of that. And there's something else to consider, which I think it's worth noting. While I do not agree with several of the things that Fred Coulter teaches or believes, I do recognize Mr. Coulter's ordination as an elder in the Church of God and his scholarship when it comes to language and a history of the published Bible. He has studied it for many years and has written several books in that regard, including a chronology of the Gospels, which I think is very interesting to read. Fred Coulter published a translation of the Bible that is called a faithful translation. And that title is debatable. I think it does have its problems, as do all translations of the Bible. Most of the modern translations have more problems than, I was speaking with Mr. Blank about this yesterday and also a few days ago, and it's our understanding that the King James Version and the New King James Version are the most accurate as far as the history of the scriptures go and how it should read. But in any case, I think William might disagree with my New King James. I read the New King James. I haven't found too many problems with it. About as many as are in the King James, but of course, that's a matter of debate. In any case, the translation that was put out by Coulter does not omit Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. They are included in the text, and so it's a Church of God individual who's very knowledgeable who agreed that those should be a part of the text of the Bible and that they should remain. In fact, if we were to remove, let's say we We go along with the idea that verses 9 through 20 were added and they shouldn't be there. And if we just remove those scriptures, how would it end? Well, it would end in verse 8. So they went out quickly and they fled from the tomb, and they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end. That seems kind of odd. I mean, especially when you look at all the other books of the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, they do not end abruptly like that. There's a conclusion to the end of their account of Christ's ministry. In any case, John 20, if you will, John 20. Mary Magdalene is the first person to see Christ after being raised. And it appears that she didn't stick around very long, that she was very excited, and she ran to tell the others that he had risen, obviously wanting them to see him and speak with him as well. In John 20, in verse 2, it says, she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and John's writing in the third person, speaking of himself, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. And Peter therefore went out, and the other disciple, and were going to the tomb. And so they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet he did not go in. And then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen clothes lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded together in a place by itself. So you get the impression that Christ rose from the dead. He came out of that linen, but he took the handkerchief that was placed over the body, over his face, if you will, folded it and set it aside, and then proceeded to go out of the tomb. Then the other disciple who came to the tomb went in also and saw, and he believed. For as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. And then the disciples went away again to their homes. But Mary, and this is where it gets interesting, Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and she wept, and she stooped down and looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Now when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And she, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And this resonated with her. She turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say, teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene, she came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord and that he had spoken these things to her. So very well maybe this is the first appearance of it to anyone when she appeared to Mary Magdalene here. But my point is the last couple of verses we read there, where it says, "Do not cling." He told her, "Do not cling to me." Now that's how my translation reads. Many, and I think a more accurate translation is, "Do not touch me." And the reason is, well, there's a few reasons, but the first of which is this term, this Greek term, haptomai, that this term is used in the New Testament 36 times. 35 times it's translated as touch, as touching something, like with your finger or with your hand, of touching something. Only once is it translated as cling. "Do not cling to me." And the point was, or the point is that I do not think Mary touched him. And then he said, "Well, hang on, I don't want any hugs right now." I don't think she touched him at all, that he said, you can't touch me. And she was very excited, and you can understand her excitement, and she probably wanted to give him a hug. And he saw it coming and said, "Don't touch me. I have not yet ascended to my father and to your father, but I'm going to go tell them that this is happening, that this is going to be happening very soon. And so the only conclusion that can be made about touching him would cause some form of, why couldn't she touch him? And my only conclusion is that there was some form of impurity, perhaps, that would have been transferred, that he could not allow to happen before he would ascend to the most holy Father. Now, like the sheaf, this is compared to the sheaf that was unleavened. During these days, leaven portrays sin. It's something we're supposed to remove from our lives as a way of, an acted oracle of getting sin out of our lives. And so Christ, he needed to remain undefiled in this way before he could ascend to the Father as an acceptable offering, once for all. Now, we don't have the logistics as to exactly why he could not have physical contact. That is my opinion. I think, it's an educated one, but it is still an opinion. And it's undeniable, though, that he said, "Don't touch me." And so there had to be a good reason. And if you can come up with a better one, I would like to hear it. But I think this is the answer here. That's a conclusion based on the evidence that we have. Let's go to Matthew 28, if you will. We're getting close to the end here. Matthew 28. Other accounts of events when people began to come to the tomb before the sun had risen that Sunday indicate that there were others that visited in these early hours. And in Matthew 28 and verse 6, an angel spoke to some. Oh, I'm not quite there yet. Here we go. An angel spoke to some of these and said, "He is not here, for he is risen." And he said, "Come see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And indeed he is going before you into Galilee, and there you will see him. Behold, I have told you." So they went out quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to bring his disciples word. And we see that as John's account we had just read, after those people left, that's when he appeared to Mary at the tomb as she was weeping outside. And he said, "Don't touch me." But now they had gone to tell the disciples. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, "Rejoice." So they came and they held him by the feet and worshiped him. And Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren that I go to Galilee, and there they will see me." And so the first encounter with Mary, which was not that long before this, he said, "Don't touch me." But now people were allowed to touch him, and they held him by the feet. And the only conclusion is that he had since ascended, that he had risen but had not ascended yet, and now he had ascended, and you can touch him. He went to the Father, and then he returned, in and out of time and space. He can come and go as he pleases. And that likely matches with the wave sheaf offering, because the wave sheaf offering, as we had looked at, was to be given on the day after the weekly Sabbath. And traditionally, in our reading and understanding of this, is that it was given at approximately I think it calls it the third hour, which would equate to around 9 o'clock. 6 o'clock being a time generally when the sun began to rise, 9 o'clock about the time when the wave sheaf offering would be given. And so Christ, just like the wave sheaf offering, was presented before the Father as an acceptable offering. He accepted it, and he rose and ascended. He is the first fruit offering, and that point is undeniable, that he's the first fruit offering. And there are several scriptures that indicate that. Let's go to, for our last scripture here, 1 Corinthians 15. There is, of course, some speculation in the connection between Christ and the wave sheaf in regards to some of these incidents after his resurrection before he ascended, and I would not call any of it far-fetched, but I do think it is a match. However, something that we cannot deny is that Christ is represented by the wave sheaf. It's not just an opinion that he may have been represented by the wave sheaf. There is hard evidence, and so I mentioned some of it today, but not all. There is more that we could go through, perhaps another time. For now, the wave sheaf ceremony, it was performed on the day after the weekly Sabbath. So tomorrow morning, if it was being done today, if we had a Levitical priesthood and a high priest, that it would be something that would be performed tomorrow morning. And that is a piece. That's a piece of the prophetic puzzle of Christ's ministry and his eventual return. And it's a piece, of course, that points to when we observe Pentecost, the 50th day, the morrow after the Sabbath being a 50th day. So Christ is represented all throughout the Torah. Christ told the Jews, you search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and they are the verses that speak of me. They talk about him continually as the God of the Old Testament as well as the Messiah of the New Testament. And so he is represented, as we had gone through in some of these chapters of Exodus, he's represented by the death of the firstborn. He's represented by the redemption of the firstborn, those that were protected and those that would need to be redeemed. He's represented by the high priest of the tabernacle, the high priest of the temple. He's represented by the offerings that were given at the temple, the sin offering, the peace offering, the burnt offering, all these offerings. They all have aspects representing Christ. They are a witness to his existence. He's represented by the Passover lamb. Clearly, nobody will deny that, even though many people that don't keep Passover deny that day should be kept, but they'll recognize that the Passover lamb or goat, you could use a goat, that they represent Christ. And even in the Day of Atonement, there were 2 goats used in the Day of Atonement ritual, and he's represented by one of those goats, not both, as some say. And he's not represented by the goat of departure, the Azazel goat. He's represented by the goat upon which the Lord's lot fell, the one that was presented as an offering. And then in our day, the days we are in the midst of now, he is represented by the unleavened bread, putting the sinless nature of Christ, the omer of unleavened manna, portraying that, putting it in us to sustain our lives, to hopefully one day give us eternal life, and removing the leavening that portrays pride and sin. And so Christ was the first to be raised and ascend to heaven as evidence, a witness that others will follow. That gives us great hope. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 20 says, "But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since by man came death," speaking of Adam, "by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. But each in his own order. Christ, the firstfruits, afterward those who are Christ's." When? Not now. People don't die and go to heaven today. It says, those who are Christ's at his coming, when he is going to return. A time before he returns, people will be raised from the dead. Those chosen will become the bride of Christ and be a part of his government that will reign on the earth for 1,000 years. And that is what we focus on. That's what we focus on this Sabbath. That's what we think about every Sabbath. That's what we talk about during all of the holy days. The return of the true bread from heaven.